So today we start on that pathway of the pillars of joy. As you looked at the 8 different pillars, are there some of those that kind of resonated easier for you? And then other ones that you had to kind of go, yeah, that's a tougher one for me. Anybody else have that experience? That's the challenge of it, is no matter how good you are at one of the pillars, if we want to become really good, you've got to develop as many and as far reaching of those pillars as possible. And so today's pillars might be easy for you. And so, you know, like, pray for those of us who have to struggle with some of them. And then next week, maybe we'll reverse the trend. Okay. So the first one is perspective. For me, here are the 2 that we're going to do this week: perspective and humility. Perspective, I do pretty well on. Humility, I have to ask myself, when is it that I am? And when is it that I'm not quite doing that? Facebook, for example, I don't approach that with much humility sometimes, because I'm pretty right on Facebook, especially compared to, right? And so I had to like struggle with, how do I incorporate that better into my life and into my heart? But let's start with perspective, because I'm an expert on that one, all right? When you talk about perspective, why is it that you get stuck in a smaller instead of a larger perspective? What catches your heart? What makes it so you can only go this far in your broadening? Jade?
When it hooks something from my past.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those places where somewhere before you've been hurt or isolated or whatever it happens to be, it definitely affects today, doesn't it? Anyone else?
I think just being born a white American, we have a lot of privileges. And so our perspective comes from there. And it's important to break out of that and try to put yourself in other people's shoes and see what it would be like to live in more poverty and with more injustice.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for that perspective to be wider than where we initially come from.
Yeah. And the problem with that, of course, Nancy, is that oftentimes privileges are owned but not questioned. And so we don't even think about having them or somebody else not having them. Think about what it's been like for women in America versus men. I get to take for granted that I can just walk into a hospital and not be questioned no matter where I go, because I just walk with authority. Whereas my female colleague, who may be more intelligent, more educated, more experienced as a pastor, might have to, might be questioned more than I am. But I don't question that because I know what I can do, so why can't she? Right? What else gets in the way of perspective?
One of the most obvious is ego.
Yeah. Yeah. How could anything but what I see easily be true? Right? Because if I haven't thought of it, I haven't put it in my radar, why does anybody want to look at it? But the obvious counterpoint to that is who has been confronted sometime in the last week or so by someone who doesn't quite see it your way? Sees something larger, different, just maybe bizarrely from your perspective, but doesn't see it from your perspective. What do you do in that moment? That's what this chapter is about. And the basic key to this chapter is, the broader your perspective, the better you are. They never say it quite like that, but isn't that kind of the thing? If you can see from a larger perspective than just your own, then you're going to do better. But how did they say to do that? to step back. Okay? Because if you're right up against something, you only see a very small piece of it. And it might be absolutely correct what you see. But if you step back, it might be larger than just that.
You know, it reminds me of a story about the 6 men and the elephant, the 6 blind men and the elephant, and they each held or touched something different on the elephant. And they didn't realize, you know that story, right?
Yes.
And they couldn't see the whole, because they were blind, they couldn't see the whole elephant. And I think, you know, we're a lot, that's a good story
It
to
is.
bring us home.
Yeah, because obviously, if I'm holding the trunk of the elephant, it does feel like a snake. And so it's not a wrong perspective to think that, but it doesn't describe the elephant, does it?
Right.
Right? So where in your life do you think that you were just holding on to the legs of the elephant, or just to the ears of the elephant, or just one piece of, and somebody looked at you and said, got news for you. Sometimes we welcome those kinds of moments, don't we? But other times, Jamie, you're the one with the most recent experience with teenagers, and teenagers are pretty good at telling us, "Mom, I got a different perspective on things." How did you get through the last few years being challenged that way?
Prayer. No.
It does help, right? To be in some kind of space where you're not just trusting yourself, but you're placing your heart into that larger. What else?
I do not have a good answer to that question.
And the hard part is I'm guessing that when your daughter went through school, right, and she challenged you in all the different ways she challenged you, that you thought you had the answers perfectly. And then Ian comes along, right? Anybody have that kind of issue with one child versus the other?
Well, I see it in my spouse more than myself, and with Ian. Ian's the most trustworthy of the 3 children, and the spouse wants to trust him the least, and I'm sort of confused. But I haven't tried to change his mind.
Yeah. And maybe that's the real tough part about perspective, isn't it? What somebody sees is true, even if it's small. And so they are holding on to it, and you have to figure out what to do to say, I don't see it that way. And sometimes you don't have to challenge it. I wrote to my friend Dean, you know, the one I argue with all the time on Facebook. I wrote to him this week and said, in reply to one of his posts, I said, I'm so glad that you're opposed to this. It lets me know that I'm on the right path. Thank you. So I didn't try to change him, but I definitely said, I'm somewhere else. Partially so he would know that there's somewhere else.
As for kids, what popped into my mind was I would tell people that when your kids turn 13, parents become stupid, and when the kids turn 22, the parents get smart again, because kids' perspective is very different.
You know, part of why that happens. It happens primarily because as they go through puberty, become an adult, right? Their job literally is to leave the nest. And so they've got to find reasons to say, this is why I need to go and do something and be something more than what mom and dad have been for me, right? Parents might have this, but they don't have all these things over here. And so that perspective in as a 12, 13, 14-year-old really is built into us biologically. whether we like it or not. The hard part is trying to get those kids from 14 to when they can actually get through and care for themselves and be a responsible adult. Because that's a long gap. That's one of the hardest things I think for child raising these days, is that it's a long gap from physical maturation to social maturation and financial, right? So we bear a lot of challenge during that time. But if we let it happen, what our children teach us is that, you know what our kids' job is, from my perspective? At least one of their jobs is to fix the mistake of their parents. Right? The things that we don't even see, the things that we haven't focused our attention on, their job is to take the next steps. Go beyond us. And we can either help them in that, or we can become more of the roadblock to becoming that. Jane?
Would you call that a multi-generational healing?
I think that's exactly what it is, right? Because, okay, so I look at like the racial issues that are happening right now. I grew up through the 60s as that was all being solved, right? Civil rights was being fixed, being authorized by Congress and whatnot. And so in a very real way, I grew up in a very different place than my mom and dad. But the problem is why now, half a century later, we're coming back to fix it again, is because we assumed that it was fixed at that point and that we no longer had to think about it. And our kids grew up seeing things very differently. And so maybe they can see things from a perspective that we can't. So what helps you move into that larger perspective, to a different perspective than what you had before?
There's something that I always say: I don't know what I don't know. So I can never take myself as definitive because I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Whoever's your biggest opponent in the moment often does know, though.
Yeah, but if we measure battles against other people, but it's always the internal battle.
Yeah.
At least for me, it is, and I think that's what the book is talking about: is the joy is from within.
Right. But the reason why I mentioned that is because it often is that enemy of the moment who can most readily lead me into that better space, but who I'm most reluctant to listen to. I don't know if you guys probably never have this. Okay, I know many of your spouses, and they're pretty good people, and so I'm sure this never happens. But my wife often says things that I just don't agree with at first. And I have to learn to see that maybe she's got some correctness about that perspective. And I have to sometimes choose to move towards that larger answer than what I had before the discussion that we have. But it's a certain amount of inertia, if you will, that I have to overcome. My perspective already seems good enough for me, and she says, but, and broadens that out. That's why I think they mentioned that self-centeredness is our default perspective, but we can choose to see larger. So I want you to just take a few moments and just sit in a space where you remember the people who helped you get to that larger perspective. And I don't mean just the ones who dragged you kicking and screaming into a larger perspective, but also the ones whose class you sat in and just soaked in the bigger pictures that they were giving to you. The people who, you know, were somehow just living in such a way that they called to your spirit to walk down that same path. The folks who somehow or another opened a door that you hadn't seen before. Maybe not even the door, and for sure not whatever was on the other side of it. Who are some of those people for you? Jade.
I have a friend, Mike, and we've been friends for about 40 years. And about 20 years ago, around 2003 or something, we got in a big disagreement, basically caused by some third-party people. It kind of dragged, I felt like I was kind of dragged into it.
Okay.
And I was really, really angry with him. And I raised my voice. I was hugely angry. I raised my voice and walked up a three-story parking lot, a garage, screaming. And what I got out of it was the gift of forgiveness. Because it was about 4 or 5 years, but I forgave him, and we are very close friends at this point for another, let's say, 15 years now.
Nice. And I think you're right that if you don't have perspective, larger perspective, it is hard to get to that forgiveness place, isn't it?
The lesson I got out of it, where I didn't want to go, was I got so, I don't know, somehow I ended up, that was the person I first forgave in my life. I never knew what forgiveness was.
But that sounds like what part of what you got to was what they said, what they were saying right near the end of the chapter, where it said that perspective leads to serenity and equanimity. And they begin to talk about interdependence. And you when you can get to that space, you realize that something more than just yours can have value.
Yes. But I kind of went kicking and screaming into that one.
Sure. You're the only one that way.
Really?
No, nobody else has had that issue.
The comment I liked, it really caught my attention in this chapter on perspective, is the author gave the analogy of people that have gone out into space and looked at the Earth and seen this blue ball, and saw the fullness of that blue ball of the world, compared to perspective being on land. And I thought, yeah, well, that astronaut needs to use that comment in his advertisements.
And one of the things that I noticed, and they didn't quite say it this way, but it didn't have the nice United States is red and Canada is blue and Mexico is yellow, and you know, all the nice things we've gotten used to on our globes, right? It didn't have all that. And we way too often sit with the boundaries we've drawn around us that maybe from a larger perspective aren't really there. Right? Think about even just what we're doing right now. We're all defined by the walls that are around us in isolation, but we're not as well. Right? Here we are, all still with physical walls around us, but together in a different space. That's a good thing for us to do emotionally and spiritually as well. One of the true gifts that St. Francis has given to me is that I don't have to have every other place that I've always been in, I have always had to preach the party line, right? The Christian line. And I could deviate a little bit, but they didn't really want to hear that as much. St. Francis has no lines that way. Well, maybe there are. I just haven't found them yet. Right? There's a broadness to what can be explored, what can give meaning, what can help other people see and move into. And so it's allowed me to explore spirituality in a way that I haven't before as a pastor, right? Because I had to be the provider of the party line. I think what's good about that, okay, so the part of the chapter that was interesting and challenging to me was that part about I, me, and we, us. And wasn't that interesting where he said, the folks that have more of an I, me perspective have both higher heart attack rates and also are more likely to be depressed. Isn't that an interesting point? That if we can see us better and blur the lines between you and I, essentially the spirit in me greets the spirit in you, right? If we can do that, we actually improve our health. I think that's just incredible. So that was the easy one for me. Now we go to the other one where I will need more of your help, right? And the reason why humility is a little bit more challenging is why? Because I've been educated to know things, right? I've got a master's of divinity, just that name, right? I'm a master of divinity, right? How do you do that and still have humility? How do you get the education, the proficiency, all this stuff that allows you to function well in your world and still hold on to things lightly about yourself and keep yourself willing to be humble? You guys have some of those same types of stories, Dr. Jamie, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not the brightest one at my clinic, so that helps me keep me humble.
It does. It always helps that way, right?
Yep, the boss.
But Nancy, with 700 years of teaching abilities, right?
Well, I'll tell you, this pandemic has been very humbling. It's a wonderful thing that we're all experiencing it together.
Yeah.
And that there's a commonality that I've never felt with people. I remember being in Costco early on and seeing everybody with a mask, and I was just coming out and a man had a mask and he said to his wife, well, this is a new kind of normal. And it struck me that we're all feeling the same thing. There's a feeling of our own mortality. You know, it's like, doesn't matter how many experiences you've had or degrees you've had, we're all mortals. We're all going to die. And it's kind of the lottery. You don't know who's going to get it and who's not. And there's, I mean, other than wearing the mask, of course, but even all those things doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get through this thing. So, I mean, those things, those thoughts pop up at 3 in the morning for me anyway.
Yeah.
And I know that as I'm laying there thinking that, there's a zillion other people thinking the same thoughts. So there's been this kind of bond with total strangers that I've never felt before.
Yeah.
And it's like I found people just driving down the road, not always, but it seems like they're more willing to let you in. There's a kind of a niceness that people are adopting because it is a hard time.
Yeah.
Or they should if they haven't.
Yeah. And I hope we keep some of that, because the problem with our society is, and this is not a bad thing necessarily, but it leads to some dysfunction if we're not careful, is that it teaches us to be independent and proficient and capable at whatever we do. And if we're not careful, it means that I can say very easily, I do all this better than you. I do this and I don't need you. I do this and you can't tell me how not to do it. And I think that this is what all of this taught us, at least to some degree. I don't know, maybe you didn't teach, you haven't learned this yet, but it taught me I'm not in control of everything.
Yeah.
There's stuff that I can't make better.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Humbling.
So it is humbling to all of us as a whole. And well, I shouldn't say that, because I think there's people that are still fighting that and still want to have all that control. And they're really struggling right now, if that's where they're at. But what is it that you've tried to control that you figured out sometime sooner or later that you couldn't?
Spouse.
Yeah, I call that Joni syndrome.
Former spouse.
Right? We do that a lot in our primary relationships, don't we? We look and we say, if you will just act this way, then. And
That's how mom.
it's pretty impossible to do, isn't it? But we do it. Almost all of us fall prey to that until hopefully we learn better. Where else?
I have a great story.
Yes.
So, I don't know, I'm going back quite a number of years. I'm running into 7-Eleven. It was the time that I was still smoking. Just get a pack of cigarettes, run back out, run to the car, and I see that the engine is running. And I go, oh, I left the engine running, which probably wasn't super uncommon for me. I'm living in a small town, and I'm not worried about somebody stealing the car, and I'm in and I'm out. And I open the car door, and the radio's on, and I don't really remember the radio being on.
Mm.
And then I realized this isn't my car.
Oh.
That is 7-Eleven, and he looks at me, and immediately I point to my car, which was identical. So he understood. My takeaway from this is we all have these embarrassing moments.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's the human condition. And it just makes it easier to show up that way, and not be embarrassed and not being humiliated, because we're human.
Yeah.
We're not perfect. Things like that's going to happen, and to accept that we're less than sometimes, that's just a condition.
Yeah. And that leads towards the next chapter, and we won't go there yet, but that's about humor. That if we're truly going to be humble, we've got to be able to see life through less than a serious face a lot of times. Right? Something that breaks down the walls of efficiency and perfection. I grew up with a scripture that said, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect." Remember that scripture? It's from the Sermon on the Mount. Be perfect. And it was taken very literally in my house. You were supposed to be perfect, without sin. But you know what that word really means? It's the word teleos. And teleos which could be interpreted as perfect, is more better defined as whole. Be complete. Be that which you are created to be. And if I'm trying to be without mistake, I will fail. But if I can, in the midst of having made mistakes, hear the new course and correct and move towards a fuller space, then I can both develop the humility I need and continue to move forward. Because you're right, we all open the wrong door sometimes.
I have found, and I don't have a real good example, but the greater belief that I am absolutely right and the greater insistence that I put out that I am not mistaken, the odds are going up quickly that I've screwed up. And I've finally in life can sometimes see that and say, maybe I better be quiet right now and reassess before I really make a wreck.
And I'm sure, Jamie, that you've never spoken those words when you should have stopped.
Yeah. Well, and when it's to people you can't apologize to, like the poor person at DMV where I told them there was no way I had ever received that title for that vehicle, I can never find her again and say, yeah, my bad, I had it.
Yeah.
So I need to give grace a little more often because it has been given to me.
It's said at one point, as they were it was kind of contrasting humility and arrogance, and it says arrogance typically comes from insecurity. And when I've been in those kinds of places where you were at, Jamie, where I was forging forward and acting like I was right, it was usually some kind of lie, some kind of flaw, some kind of thing that I was trying to cover up, where I'm saying, oh no, I can't be wrong. I didn't receive the title. And it was this insecurity about, why didn't I do it right? I can't admit to it.
Well, I didn't know that I'd screwed up for a long time afterward.
Yeah.
I was convinced I was right.
Yeah. But oftentimes that gets us deeper and deeper, doesn't it?
Yep. Didn't do any. Yeah. Really didn't help.
Yeah. Like I don't know if you've ever done this, where you fight the battle that you don't have to fight. Right? Doesn't matter if you win or not against a DMV person, does it? Not
True.
You.
And in the big scheme of things, for having somebody, leaving somebody feeling like crap, that's a loss for both of us.
Yeah. Now the tough part about this chapter, though, too, is they also said we often confuse humility with timidity. That we should be timid, and that's not what it is. We need to live our lives boldly, shall I say, but not in the I have all the answers type of way, right? Because we do have places where we're supposed to step into, the role that we're given, right? And I'm going to tell you that if my dog gets sick, I'm not bringing him to most of you, right? I want to go to someone who knows how to take care of my puppy dog, right? And so I need that person to step into that role, not in an arrogant way necessarily, but because they do have the skills for that job. And so when someone comes to you and say, Jade, will you? Nancy, can you? If they're asking something that is there for you, you have to figure out how not to be timid about it. Not to knock everyone out of the way to say, I can do it and you can, but to step into that role. Not because you're perfect either. Not because you know the answer perfectly, but because you're the right person for the job. But that can work against our humility, can't it? So how have you, Jade, go ahead.
Well, I think it's in a competitive situation. Okay, it's difficult a lot of people oversell themselves,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like we're in a world today where we're like a certain president, basically says things all the time that aren't the truth, and people are so used to that. It's so acceptable today that it's hard to be genuine and who you are, and in a sense be competitive sometimes when you're in a competitive situation.
Yeah. And the hard part is that much of that dynamic is because I have the secret knowledge that you don't have. I understand I understand the conspiracies or whatever it is that makes it so that I can and you can't. And that's, bottom line is, that's a lack of humility, right? Because here's the bottom line I know about people that I meet. I may know a whole lot, but every single one of them knows something I don't know. Every single one of them, right? And is their knowledge right then the knowledge that I need in that moment? 2 years ago, I went on this trip that was different for me. I'd gone to Pucallpa and brought a team to Pucallpa, and then I got to the airport in Lima, and I said goodbye to my team. And I got on an airplane and went to the northern part of Peru to Jaén, and went where I'd never gone before, and had to put myself in the hands of people who knew that area better than what I did, and trust something more than just what I knew. And it was some of the best times of my life. It was a glorious few days as I trusted something more than me. But it takes stepping beyond yours, because if you do that, you stay inside the walls of your own room, right? Because I know my room, however messy it is, I got it under control here, and I don't step into the larger room. And isn't that what Spirit always calls us to do, is that larger room? Something more than just what we know. The problem is that, well, right at the beginning, they said this: humility is not something that one can claim to have, right? Because as soon as you claim it, you've lost it. So how do you keep that openness to continually be learning, growing, not knowing everything? What's helped you in your life to do that? Because all of you, well, I don't know, I don't know, Lilith and Susan, I don't know you as well, but I know these folks, and many of them have a lot of competence, a lot of skill, a lot of abilities, but I also know them to be extremely humble, right? And open to something more than just themselves. So how have you guys done that?
Well, I was thinking about your experience in travel, and traveling does keep you humble, and you do have to rely on the kindness of strangers many times. And I don't have trouble being humble because I believe I just don't know a whole lot. And I've been fortunate as the baby of the family. I have 2 older sisters. So all along my life, that one was 8 years older, 9 years older, I would go to them and say, okay, what's high school like? Can I handle college? And you know, I'm going to get married. What's that like? So I was really fortunate in that way because I went to them and showed how little I knew, but I learned a lot from them. And now it's not necessarily traveling outside of the country, but what it is traveling, getting older. So my one sister is 75, one 76. And so it's like, well, what's that like?
Yeah.
And how's your body doing? And that's really humbling when something doesn't work on you. And
Some of you may not know that yet because you're not quite of an age, okay? But sooner or later, bodies start not working perfectly. For those of you who haven't experienced that yet. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, well, that's just it. That will keep you very humble. You don't have to go very far to Peru. You have to, you know, if your leg it doesn't work or broken, just getting to the next room is difficult.
Yeah, yeah. How about the rest of you?
Well, mutual respect makes it really easy.
Yeah.
You know, and by not thinking that we know everything, with mutual respect, we're open to hear things.
Yeah, I think that's exactly part of it is do I have my ears closed or my mind closed, right? Or am I still listening? So I want us to take just a second. We'll go back to that question I just asked in a bit, but I want us to take just a second to go through a practice that I will send to you. It's one from the book, and it's about humility. And it's not something that we can really do well right now, but I want to read through it for you so that you begin the process of doing it. And here's what it says. Reflect on all the people who are responsible for your life. Think of your parents who gave you life, your teachers who taught you, the people who grew your food and who made your clothes, the countless others who are responsible for you, for your having the life that you have each and every day. Now think of all those who discovered and created all the things we take for granted, the housing, the crops, and the medicine that keeps you alive. Think of all the ancestors who had to live and survive so that you could be born, who braved enormous hardship so that you could have the life that you do. Now think of the family and friends who give your life meaning and purpose. And then it goes on to say, allow your heart to open and experience love and appreciation for all these people. I think if we would on a regular basis sit and in our mind make a list of the people that day from whom we received something, it would help us a lot. I mean, how often do you go through something, say you're driving down the street and you take the time to thank someone for whoever invented the street lights, whoever decided to put up the signs that are there, those things that allow us to navigate together a very crowded thoroughfare. And if you do that in every place, as you walk into a building and you think about who allowed that building, who helped that building to be there, that process of thinking about it and giving thanks for, I think is helpful to us. So I want you to just take a second and each one tell me one person you thought of during that time. Who was it? Who was a person that came into your mind as one of the people who are responsible for your life?
I don't know who they are. They're growing the food, they're picking the vegetables, they're making the clothes in some other country, hopefully not in a sweatshop.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I don't know who they are.
Yeah. Sometimes they are the unnamed people, the unnameable. Who else?
Well, I'm looking at a bookshelf right now, and there's probably 100 books. So each book, there's many people that went to create it, you know, as well as the author, the publisher, and the printer, and so forth. So if you were to put all the people that those books represent, it would take up, you know, a big theater. And I'm just looking at this bookshelf, and I think we're so fortunate to have been able to learn to read, the people that helped me to learn to read, and then the people that wrote those books. And now I've read those books. It's kind of a wonderful exchange.
So one of my saints is called Ms. Dysart. Can't even remember her picture. I mean, her face. Can't remember a thing about her. I just know she was my first grade teacher because I know she helped me to know how to read. Unseen, but absolutely essential to any other learning I did. Who else? Who else did you think of?
I was thinking about one of my first girlfriends who taught me to love myself.
Nice. Nice. Go ahead.
My Grandma Joe is the one that came to mind. And actually, Grandma Joe is not my biological grandmother. She became my grandmother when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. And she taught me that you can always find good in every person, no matter how bad they are. You can always find good in them. And that's carried me many, many, many places and many times. So I could wanted to dislike, but I could find, I'd focus in on, there's something good, and I can find it.
Thank you. And that's an important thing as you go through this practice, because how many, if you look back, have at least one person who you don't want to thank as being one of your saints, but yet they were part of how you learned and grew into who you are? Not everyone who leads us forward is easy, are they?
No.
So who needs you today? Part of humility, a challenging part of humility sometimes, is being willing to step into the role, even when you know that you're not quite completely prepared for it. I talked to a couple this week who's about to get married. There's nothing like marriage or the beginning of a family to tell you what you don't know, right? And so they're kind of looking at, we love each other, but how do we do this? And so you take each step and you learn together and you help each other and you just keep moving forward, right? But isn't that what's often true about life? Nancy, the first year you're a teacher, you don't know everything, do you? Right? Garnet, the first time someone laid on a table ready for your hands, wasn't it a bit intimidating? Right? But if you don't step into the role, you also don't become what else you can become. You have to have the humility to move forward into that role, and the courage sometimes as well, right? And it takes that. So today, where is it that you're not humble? Where is it that your arrogance shows too easily? Can I take the easy one? Facebook. How about you? Where is it that you have to fight to be the non-arrogant one? Jade.
When I go to professional meetings and organizations I belong to.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
Marriage.
Marriage is an ongoing task that way, isn't it?
For me.
As soon as you think you know everything in a marriage, you're going to be in trouble. Anyone else? Joni today is not with us. She'd love to be here today, but let me tell you where she is. At 6:30, their district started a board meeting. And the board meeting is about, she teaches first grade for those of you who don't know it. And this meeting was about what do we do as we start this next school year. And Joni is very intimidated right now, having just gone through cancer in the spring and looking at COVID now. She's more nervous than I've ever seen her about stepping into a classroom, and more nervous than even what she was right after she finished chemo and went back to teach last year. Right? In March, she went back to teach. And now she's there going, can I, should I, what do I do? So she went to a board meeting and there were like 200 people online when she talked to me just before this started. And in her district, they get sent out a thing that said, who wants to, we're going to give two options, who wants to teach at home and who wants to teach online. And close to 50% of the teachers said, we want to teach online. And yet the district was going to say, no, this is the only answer to teach, that this is the preset to teach in classroom. And so she's having to ask these questions as, what do I do? Do I say yes to that which is very frightening? Do I stand up and say, I'd rather do this where she feels safer? Humility can't answer every question, but going into a space like this, like Joni's going into, feels much like some of those places I've had to go into. How do you go forward when you don't have all the right answers? Where has that been for you this week, this month, this year? Jamie, you're muted, but you sounded great.
Thanks. In medicine, we frequently move forward when we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And I'm not always right.
But you have to sometimes too, because if you have in a new situation and somebody's hurt, a situation where there's healing that needs to happen, you have to take your best guess, don't you? Where else?
I'm going to my niece's a wedding, maybe, hopefully, next month in Denver.
Yeah.
I prayed it hell that I don't take something, get something, or expose somebody else. And I'm going to her wedding shower on Saturday, and I'm wearing a mask. But there's the increased risk. So,
well, and all of this struggle around masks and infection and safety for us throws us all into this place of non-ease, well, just of non-ease, right? We don't have simple safety. We don't have simple health. We don't have simple control. And yet I truly think that some of the mask or no mask battle is a battle of just trying to say, I got to have control of something, and I can control whether or not I put on a mask. But do you see the arrogance just in that? You may not recognize it, but I recognize it because I've done that same thing in other issues, not about masks, about other issues, right? Where if I look back on it, I go, wow, that wasn't very humble of me. That was me already having all the truth. And moving in a place like this, you learn real quick that you don't have all the truth, do you? How about the rest of you? As you struggle this week, don't be afraid of the humility that's tossed at you. And don't be intimidated by saying, I can't have strength, because humility doesn't mean non-strength. In fact, to be humble in a situation, to be open and ready to continue to learn, takes an amazing amount of strength, right? To just go kind of like I was just saying, and not wear the safety device because you already have the right answer. That's not strength. That's insecurity. Where is it that you can be willing to learn and grow in this moment? Because I think that right now, all that's happening, whether it's the racial unrest, the COVID stuff, all of that is asking us to change and become something we've never been before. And we can arrogantly go back to what we already know. Or we can humbly listen and be changed by the moment. I'm pretty sure which one the Spirit asks us to do. Or was that too arrogant to say that? All right, guys, thank you for your time. Next week, we'll do the next 2 chapters. All right? Any last words before we go?
Well, I'm going to just
Bring
share
you
this
guys-
book. I'm just going to share this book again, Made for Goodness. And I think Desmond Tutu says it correctly, that we are made for goodness. We are imperfect, like, going into the wrong car. But even that is so sweet, because you could share that and we could all understand. And I think we need to just be aware of the divinity that's in us and let it flow to other people around us.
Perfect. Thank you. Good to see you all. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.